Well, hello everybody, it's me, Mitch. I'm standing here wearing my old guy t-shirt, and I love this thing. I'm recording this as a short introduction to this video, which is part 3 of a series on how we got here. Part 1 dealt with Ellen White and the religious influence on our dietary recommendations. Then we went to John Harvey Kellogg and the Battle Creek Sanitarium and their influence on trying to tell everybody that being a vegan or a vegetarian is the proper way to eat, and that red meat is bad for you and will kill you. And the third installment of this is probably one of the most influential people in actually getting this message baked into our government's food pyramid and recommendations, and that's Ansel Keys and the fraud that he perpetrated trying to prove his diet heart hypothesis. The basis of all this, we're going to talk about that and show you exactly how he did it. So stay tuned. I hope you're interested in this video. It's important. It's very important, because without this knowledge, you can't have a conviction that you're doing the right thing, and you won't really worry about whether you're harming yourself by eating a diet that our species evolved on over 3 million years. So with that, I'm going to cook my breakfast. Take it away. Well, thank you, Mitch. In part 3 today of how we got here, I want all of you to meet Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys was the man who hypothesized that heart disease and diabetes and every other ailment that plagued human beings was caused by their diet, eating too much red meat and too much cholesterol and too much saturated fat. That's the advice that we're still given today. Now, over the years, this man has been studied intently. His data, the sources of his data, the conclusions he drew, the studies that he promoted, all to enforce his agenda of proving himself right and everybody else wrong. So we're going to take a quick look at this. We're not going to go too long with it, but we're going to hit the highlights, and if nothing else, give you food for thoughts and food for your own personal investigation. All of his work was centered around proving through studies that the higher the consumption of saturated fat, the fat calorie percentage shown across the bottom of this graph, the higher the death rate shown up the left side in deaths per 1,000. So let's understand this chart first. The chart shows that at the top of the chart, it shows eight deaths per 1,000 as the highest on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, it shows saturated fat, or total percentage of fat consumption, at 40%. And the line that sweeps from the bottom left to the top right shows that the more percentage of fat that you eat, the more of you are going to die. Simple, makes sense. He did a study called the 7-country study, and he plotted those countries along this line, with Japan at the bottom, then Italy, then England and Wales, then Australia, then Canada, and then the USA, which at first glance would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that all over the world, no matter what country you live in, the more you eat in fat, the more of 1,000 of you are going to die. Die when? Who knows? But this is the 7-country study. This is the study that in essence proved Ansel Keys' hypothesis correlating fat intake with increased mortality was correct. And at first glance, who could argue with this? Now here's a chart that looks similar, but it's vastly, vastly different. It's the same 7-country study, but with the inclusion of all 22 countries from which data was gathered. Again, we don't know where they got this data. We don't know what the criteria for this data was. How do you know the percentage of fat somebody's eating when they died? Where they certainly didn't talk to all these individual people and plot them all in all these countries through their life. So this is some statistical data that was gathered from somewhere. Not important at this point. What is important at this point is that this is a graph of the 7 countries plus the additional countries numbered on the graph and listed on the right. So let's take a look at some of these other countries. Now, I noticed that the lowest number of deaths out of all of these countries was country number 14. That's Mexico. So Mexico eating 23% percentage of fat calories had a half a person in 1,000 died, and certainly number 14 did not fit on the line of the 7 countries that Ansel Keys chose to use for the results of his study that supported his hypotheses. Another interesting thing, if you look at this chart and you really do a deep dive into some of the numbers, let's look at the difference between country number 12 and country, let's go with country number 15. Country number 15 is Holland, and it's up there in the middle to the left of the line, and that is at about 20%. So Holland had, let's say, 4 deaths per 20% of their calories from fat. Compare that to number 8, which is France. France had, on a diet with 30% of their calories from fat, less than 1 death. Now, if I drew a line from Holland down to France, it would make an X across the chart that Ansel Keys drew. And if you take all of these different countries and you look at all the different results, what your takeaway is that they're random, completely random from country to country. And the country itself cannot be charted or graphed along any line. If anything, it basically shows a trend that anybody that eats more of their calories from fat, a higher percentage, the death rate's going to go up. Some countries it actually doesn't go up, but overall, if you had to look at the general trend of the dots, from left to right, it's on an upward slope. And okay, that's great. What age did these people die at? What else did they do in their lives that might have caused them to die other than just the amount of fat in their diet? How many carbohydrates did they eat? Were they using Crisco to cook with instead of butter? Did they smoke or not? Were they high wire artists that fell to their death? We don't know, because this is an epidemiological study with surveyed results. And there are so many unknowns and confounders in the results themselves that any graph of the results of these death rates versus saturated fats are meaningless. But if you go a step further and you say, I want to prove without a shadow of a doubt that the more fat people eat, the higher their death rate, I'm going to pick the 7 countries that just so happen to fall on this line that I want to look like the results. And that, my friend, is called cherry picking. And over the years, Ansel Keys has been accused by many people of cherry picking. And if you have any common sense, and if you wonder, Ansel, why did you leave France out of your 7 countries? We know that France has one of the highest fat diets in the world. Everything they eat is made out of animal products and butter and heavy cream and sauces. Even their pastries are just dripping with butter. And yet they have the lowest mortality rate of any country in your study. Why did you leave them out? Well, when you look at all this from a common sense and an analytical point of view, you don't need some statistical expert to tell you that this is a random, meaningless chart of results that are impossible to quantify without a randomized, double-blind, controlled study over many, many, many years, of which have never been done and ethically couldn't be done. Now, if you Google Ansel Keys, this is what comes up. And if you start reading down these pages of search results from Google on Ansel Keys, you'd be surprised. Well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but you will find out that Ansel Keys is a hero and a savior based on all of the articles that show up under his name, extolling his virtues and crediting him for saving us humans from horrible deaths by not advocating meat and saturated fats, but plants and fruits and vegetables and all kinds of other foods. He's a hero. It's enough to make you nauseous. I couldn't find anything anywhere that said there was a problem with the 7-country study, so I went ahead and I said 7-country study fraud in my search. And this is what I found out. And the first thing that comes up at the top, Robert Lustig criticized that Keys cherry-picked 7 of the 22 countries. Consumption of trans fat peaked in the 1960s, and Keys failed to separate them out. Results for Japan and Italy could be explained by either low saturated fat consumption or by low sugar consumption. And Keys wrote that sucrose is saturated fat, and it stops right there. That doesn't mean anything, but I do know Robert Lustig knows his stuff. So then I went down to an article next that says, the truth about Ansel Keys, we've got it all wrong. And I said, aha, here's going to be an article that's going to tell the world that we should not be eating the vegetables and the vegetarian and high sugar diet and no meat and no fat. Let me take a look at this article. So I go ahead and I click on this article, and it's Denise Minger, whoever she is rescuing good health from bad science. Wow, I love this person already. The truth about Ansel Keys, we've got it wrong. Sounds great. And we go down in this article, and She says the oft-repeated tale goes something like this. Once upon a time, a scientist named Ansel Keys did an awful thing. He published a study about different countries that made it look like heart disease was associated with fat intake. But the truth was that he started out with 22 countries and just tossed the ones that didn't fit his hypotheses. When other researchers analyzed his data using all the original countries, the link between fat and heart disease totally vanished. Keys was a fraud, and he's the reason my mom made me eat skim milk and corn checks for breakfast instead of delicious bacon and eggs. Let his soul burn, burn, burn. Okay. So far, so good. Depending on who tells the story, some of the details and wishes for eternal hellfire may differ. But in many cases, Keys' infamous cherry picking is attributed to his 7-country studies, a landmark project that helped sculpt our common beliefs about fat. Even the 7-country studies page on Wikipedia, the first hit when you Google 7-country studies, says Keys shamelessly erased the data he didn't like. Okay? And she goes on to say just how bad it is that the whole world is demonizing poor old Ansel Keys. This is what we're told is Keys' cherry-picked graph, and she goes on to say that. And as we're told, this is the man who ruined the world, the truth. And then she goes on to spin a tale about poor Ansel Keys was set up by everybody, and here's all the evidence, and you should read this stuff and it'll make you nauseous. Here's all the evidence that shows how poor Ansel Keys was so misunderstood, and he didn't cherry pick anything. And I'm sure the backing for this article came from all of those good folks at the drug companies, at the big food companies that care so much about our health and don't want us to be misled by real scientists who did actual research and found out exactly what Ansel Keys did. And the rest of the results that I found on Google, unfortunately, were all by apologists and spin doctors working like hell to save Ansel Keys' reputation, since every dime they make is reliant on the public still believing this crap, even after all of the evidence over all of the years since it happened. It's too firmly entrenched. I'm beginning to believe nothing can be done about it. It's up to you to decide. Something's got to make sense here. Something has got to add up. There's too many questions. Whether you want to believe that Ansel Keys was the savior of mankind, even though mankind has never been in such poor health in the history of their evolution, that's up to you. All you got to do is sit down at your computer and start Googling this stuff, and you'll find whatever answer you want. But predominantly, you're going to find the answer provided by the big money, the spin doctors, and the apologists. The fact of the matter, in my opinion, this is my opinion, the fact of the matter is the data that these studies were based on was weak epidemiological data filled with confounders, conflicts of interest, and the ego, one of the biggest egos in history, that of Ansel Keys, that would have done anything to save his reputation and prove that he was right. There was another doctor over in England who disagreed with Ansel Keys. And much like is happening today with our cancel culture, Ansel Keys took whatever influence he had with the press, with the government people that he worked with, and canceled Yudkin and ruined his life and his career, because he was saying it's not the fat, it's the sugar, and here's why. Those of us who actually practice a carnivore lifestyle have cured every chronic disease we had, have normalized our weight, have cleared up our foggy brains, and are living healthy, we know that wasn't because we cut out fat. When we cut out fat like they told us, that's when we got sick and fat. When we ate more fat and cut out the sugar, like Yudkin said, we became thin and healthy. So, are they trying to tell me that I'm like the kid with his hand in the cookie jar that looks at his mother and says, "My hand's not in the cookie jar, Mom. Don't believe your lying eyes"? I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. And if something doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to find out one of two things. Number one, it's wrong, and that's why it didn't make sense. Or I was wrong, and then I have to correct my opinion, and then it'll make sense again. But it has to make sense in the end. You can't be left with a question. Now, Ansel Keys was not a medical doctor. He claims he was a physiologist. But what you don't see very often is he was a fish physiologist. He was an expert on fish. It is truly astounding that this man and his hypothesis and his ego have done so much damage to the health of the human race and continue to do so, because after he was gone, there was too much bet on this hypothesis by industry, by the medical community, by all of these people that just couldn't come out and say, "We were wrong, we're sorry." That will never happen. Human arrogance, ego, and greed will not let that happen, unfortunately. And that's Ansel Keys. He's gone now. He's not alive anymore. There's a ton more to this story. But once you look at it for yourself and consider the things that I've just shown you and what makes sense and what doesn't, when you come to a clear, concise opinion of your own based on facts and observations that you made, that you can believe in, that's the purpose of this exercise, like I've said before, to strengthen your conviction that they are wrong and this is right, and this is just one more reason to challenge when your doctor says anything about eating fat or your cholesterol or any of the other what we call conventional wisdoms that have been around for 60, 70 years now that came from this man's work, from the most astounding thing that I gather from all of these charts of the 7 countries and all that. The most astounding thing, aside from everything I've pointed out to you so far, is where is France? Why isn't France in there? If I was Ansel Keys as a younger man, and I said, I think the people that eat the most fat die the most. I mean, I know that fat has the highest, I know that France has the highest fat population on the planet. What country would I go to first to prove that I was right? I'd go to France. Because if I'm right, I'm certain that they're going to be off the charts because they eat so much fat. And I don't know if any of you remember the excuse they made when they found out that the high-fat eating French are the healthiest people in the world. Here was their argument. And this is true, and listen carefully to this, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. Their argument was, well, we know that fat is bad for you. I mean, that's a given. We all know, everyone knows that. So there must be something that the French are doing that offsets all the damage that's being caused by this high-fat diet they're on. I know. It's the wine They're drinking wine. The French are drinking wine, and it's helping them stay healthy. And with that one conclusion, the wine industry of the world ignited and became what it is today, where we can't do anything without a glass of wine in our hands. And what are we drinking when we drink that wine? We're drinking everything that makes us sick. We're drinking alcohol and we're consuming sugar. We're convinced it's healthy. They have made another poison healthy with their crap. So take all this for what it's worth. I'm convinced. That's how I've been able to sustain this diet. That's why I love this way of life. Have no desire, no addictions, no cravings to ever want to eat anything else. I enjoy the health. I enjoy the clear mind. And at my age, I look forward to 20, 30, 40 more years like this, and I would not trade that for a bowl of ice cream. That's how we got here. Don't stop by just listening to this. Listen to the 100 other videos out there by Nina Teischolz, Belinda Fettke, Anthony Chaffee, all of these terrific people that will show you chart upon chart and study upon study and all of the reasons why you have to understand how this is just not logical to base the health of the human population on. And yet, here we are. So with that, ponder that a while. Take the rest of the day off and go eat meat.